Hello, I'm Terrence McNally. Welcome to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'll be speaking today with ZOE SCHLANGER about her first book, The Light Eaters, How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. You can learn more at zoeschlanger.com. That's ZOESCHLANGER. ZOE SCHLANGER, all one word, .com. On Freeform, we explore the lives, the work, the ideas of individuals that I suspect have pieces of the puzzle of a world that just might work. We look at politics, economics, environment, science, health, culture, all based on the fact that I believe we can do better, and I want to find out how. The show streams weekly on the Progressive Voices Network on TuneIn.com, and podcasts are available anytime, anywhere on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, most major podcast sites, and at my site, terrencemcnally.net. That's TERRENCEMCNALLY, Terrence McNally, all one word, .net. To introduce today's conversation, I'm going to begin with a fragment of one of my favorite poems. It's called Father Reason, and it is by the 13th century Sufi poet Rumi. This version is translated by Coleman Barks. And I suspect that it will resonate with my guest immediately and will mean more to listeners as our conversation unfolds. Here I go. Tree limbs rise and fall like the ecstatic arms of those who have submitted to the mystical life. Leaf sounds talk together like poets making fresh metaphors. The green felt cover slips, and we get a flash of the mirror underneath. Think how it will be when the whole thing is pulled away. I tell only 1/1000th of what I see because there is so much doubt everywhere. Though it's not specifically what Rumi is talking about, these lines describe well the current moment in the study of botany about which ZOE SCHLANGER writes. We are learning of capacities, abilities, talents of plants that upset our accepted attitudes and understandings, certainly for us non-scientists who live in a world surrounded and sustained by plants and to some extent created by them, but also for the scientists themselves. In recent years, we've learned about the ability of plants to communicate, to recognize their kin and behave socially, to hear sounds, to store useful memories that inform their life cycle, to morph their bodies to blend into their surroundings, camouflage, and to trick animals into behaving to their benefit. Schlanger's research over the last several years and her book reveal a reality that challenges our understanding of agency, of consciousness, of intelligence, of what a brain is. What are we to make of a vine that grows leaves to blend into the shrub on which it climbs? A flower that shapes its bloom to fit exactly the beak of its pollinator? A pea seedling that can hear water flowing and make its way toward it? This book, The Light Eaters, I see takes on at least 5 different stories. There's Zoe's personal story, why she turned to this field of botany and plant behavior in the first place, and how what she has learned has affected her. The plant story, their remarkable abilities revealed in the field and the lab. The science story, how our technology and understanding expands, how we study, what we learn. The culture of science story. It turns out the field tends to be risk averse and conservative, with a credibility protecting establishment in sort of a challenging ongoing relationship with visionary, creative, imaginative, risk-taking, curious, ambitious scientists. And finally, a worldview story. As I alluded to above, how does what we're learning influence our understanding of life and how the world works? And I think it's worth mentioning that The Light Eaters does all of this in under 260 pages. As someone who has sent and reads many books, I appreciate an author who doesn't feel compelled to deliver 400 plus pages to ask their questions, tell their stories, and make their points. ZOE, let me just tell you a bit about where I'm coming from. A lifetime of experiences, many of them taken on in my younger years, living on a sailboat in the Atlantic for 6 months, one full natural season of organic farming, from turning the soil to a Thanksgiving feast, living out of a van and traveling to the U.S. and Mexico, spending time in nature, including many national parks, seeking awe. All of these experiences led me to conclude that we are nature. Our improved technology makes new research possible, so our knowledge and our understanding grow, and what we are now able to learn brings our worldview actually closer to that of indigenous cultures. But we have arrived there through the rationalist, reductionist, practical, scientific method of the Enlightenment. So I'm prone to accept the purposeful behaviors of plants that paint them with much greater agency than had previously been revealed. Still, when I can slow down enough to really take in what I'm reading, what ZOE is telling me, it blows my mind. You know how we love a great magician, even though we know it's a trick? Well, the things that I'm learning plants are able to do have that same magical quality. Something I hadn't considered possible is actually happening. But this is no trick. And I must confess that learning some of the amazing stuff these plants do actually kind of turns me on. Let me finish with two other quotes from wise men a bit closer to us than the 13th century. First, Walt Whitman, who wrote, "A leaf of grass is no less than the journey work of the stars." And finally, naturalist John Muir, who said, "When we try to pick out anything by itself, we find it hitched to everything else in the universe." ZOE Schlanger is currently a staff reporter at The Atlantic, where she covers climate change. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, Time, Newsweek, Nation, Quartz, and on NPR and other outlets. She's cited in the 2022 Best American Science and Nature Writing Anthology, and she's a recipient of the 2017 National Association of Science Writers Reporting Award, and The Light Eaters is her first book. Welcome, ZOE Schlanger, to Freeform, a world that just might work.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
And let me tell listeners, we're recording this conversation Tuesday, June 25th. I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the ideas and work we talk about. So can you tell us briefly about how you see your path to the work you do today? Mention mentors, turning points, moments of decision. Now, I think when we talk specifically about the book, we'll talk about what attracted you to this field at this moment. So take it up to kind of where you were just before that.
Sure. Well, I am a reporter and I mostly cover the environment and climate change. And I've always been quite drawn to topics that feel like they're full of secrets. And I don't mean devilish secrets that we're not meant to know. I mean secrets because they're information that is sort of locked away, often in academia, that the public just doesn't get their hands on very often. In particular, thinking about being a reporter who covers the environment, my background is largely in covering air and water pollution, which is sort of a classic open secret situation. We can't taste whatever's in our water. We can't always smell what's in the air unless it's literally like wildfire smoke. And yet there are compounds in both places that are often problematic for health. And the only way the public gets to know about them are through the dedicated work of scientists and activists, and then reporters who then can translate information like that to the public. So that's kind of my reportorial background. I live in New York City, which is a great place to do reporting. It's a wonderful media city, but it's not a great place to experience a tremendous amount of nature and natural awe. And so I try and get out as much as I can to do reporting projects. And this book was another example of a way I could reach out into the natural world more and experience the incredible secrets plant lives hold that scientists are at this point well aware of.
Very good, very good. No, I hear that. One thing I was curious about, let me tell you, I did a 15-episode podcast series for the Wyss Institute for Biologically Inspired Engineering at Harvard, which is about as cutting edge as that sounds. And I actually lack an academic background in science, and so, but I do have a great deal of curiosity, and I felt I had the ability to make the science understandable to others who might, like myself, not have the scientific background. I recommend it, by the way. You can find it at Wyss Institute, and that's WYSS, or at my website. What is your science background, or did you fall into it as a reporter?
I do not have a PhD or a master's in any scientific background. As an undergrad, I did major in environmental studies, so there's some background there. But honestly, my background is really spending the last 10, 12 years as a science reporter talking to scientists. And there are lots of science reporters that have PhDs in hard sciences, in biology and chemistry. And then there's lots of science reporters that don't. And in some ways, it feels like a privilege to not have that background because I think it makes me better at translating jargon and kind of research ease into language that a layperson can understand because I am a layperson.
Exactly.
But in a decade of talking to researchers, I can also speak to them in their language. Mm-hmm. So it's a huge privilege. I get to have master classes in various scientific disciplines all the time just in the course of my job, and it's the best job in the world.
No, I hear what you're saying, that there are folks working on that PhD who won't have the in-depth conversation or the field lab experiences that you get to have.
Exactly. And it forces me to ask scientists questions that bring things down to the mm-hmm. human level, to really explain things for someone who doesn't have that research background.
Yeah. No, I think the role of the translator is a really important one. Any response to my introduction?
Oh, well, I thought that poem was remarkable and beautiful, and I hadn't heard it before, and obviously resonates with all of the themes of this book. This idea that there is not only so much we can listen to other organisms about, but that there's an element of a mirror there, that we can also see ourselves in the realm of biology, in the incredible profusion of diversity and ingenuity in the natural world that's just born out of it existing, that we fail to recognize that we're just part of that we are looking in a mirror all the time when we're out mm-hmm. in a forest.
And the other thing, and I will send you a copy of the full poem when we're off the air, but the other thing is, even when he says, I can only say 1,000th of what I see because there's so much doubt out there, which speaks to the whole culture of science, cutting edge, pre-paradigm shift moment that we're in.
Absolutely. I mean, as you said, science is a conservative institution. And I really respect that. I mean, scientists are dealing with the heavy burden of having to sort of write the first draft of knowledge as it pertains to that type of knowledge, scientific knowledge, and what gets entered into the canon of what we would consider scientific fact. Of course, that's one way of knowing, and there's other ways of knowing that have approached these questions and found answers long ago, and you mentioned that. Certainly plenty of indigenous cultures have incredibly fleshed out understanding of the things that science is just now coming around to mm-hmm. confirming. But yes, that conservatism does mean that science functions on doubt, and that's a good thing. It's a good backstop for quackery, ultimately, and that's that push-pull of, like you said, the cutting-edge big picture, out-of-the-box thinkers constantly encountering a backstop, a kind of council of their own peers. And it produces really rigorous results, but it means those results, they might take a really long time.
Yeah, and I must say that the amount, is certainly in the first couple of chapters, that you really delve into this was a bit of a surprise to me. Upon reflection, of course, that makes very good sense. But my guess is, to a lot of listeners and folks who are not in the science field, it would be, wait, scientists are, they're making all the crazy discoveries, and yet they're making them, as you say, against this institution that is that is conservative, as you point out, because to get it wrong or to get it sloppy is a sin.
Totally. I think there's a paper in the 70s or 80s that I cite in the book that the title was something like "The Resistance by Scientists to Scientific Discovery." And I thought it really encapsulates exactly what you're talking about here.
Exactly. Okay, so now we get right up to what is the germ of this book. How did this book happen? What was going on in your life that led you into this niche? When as anyone would say, if you're writing about pollution and climate, you've got plenty to write about every day.
Sure, definitely. Yeah. So I, at the time, was working at a newsroom covering pollution and climate change. And as you can imagine, that becomes harrowing quite quickly and deadening shortly after that. I had been covering it for years and just felt this kind of creeping numbness to the material that, like, these mega wildfires and these melting ice sheets were starting to become just sort of journalistic units, like good stories. And I was feeling myself lose touch with the material reality of all of that,
Hmm.
and to my own emotions around it. And
And
I
I would guess
decided,
also, by the way, I would guess also, as you do your reporting for years, and things sort of continue to get worse, there's got to be that feeling too of the you know the
definitely.
what does it matter? It doesn't seem, I'm doing the best I can, but
Yeah, you should really ask a climate scientist about how that feels to
oh,
be spending a lifetime on that work and no one's listening. But absolutely, it's a tough emotional space, like many people can probably relate to. And I started looking around for something in the sciences that felt wondrous, that would be awe-inspiring and make me feel that sense of wonder that is really, I find, so curative and something we can all relate to probably, even if we have to think back to being children, the
mm-hmm.
experience of having wonder as a sort of transformative and restorative emotion. Um, and I started looking at botany journals. So journalists who cover science have access to papers before they're released on the agreement that we won't publish about them until their release date. And I sort of just switched some tabs over from looking at climate journals to looking at botany journals. And what I saw there completely shocked me. There were researchers, botanists, debating openly in journals about whether or not plants might be intelligent or even possibly conscious. And so this was a sort of academic fight playing out before my eyes, which I had never heard of. And then there was also a steady stream of papers coming out just in recent years that were looking at specific behaviors of plants that were just so incredibly astounding. I fell upon the realm of kin recognition in plants, chemical signaling in plants, which we talk about as a form of communication, but goes beyond communication. There's specificity of sort of regional dialects in this type of communication, or the way you communicate with your genetic kin being different than how you communicate with strangers if you're a plant. So I realized this was exactly what I needed, and also maybe the best story of my career because I just didn't see anyone reporting on it at the time. I know there's been plenty of good work about trees sort of caring for their offspring, and we've certainly gotten a lot of excellent mushroom reporting
Yeah.
lately. Are having a wonderful moment, but I didn't see anyone paying attention to these other plants, of which there are so many. Sorry, just to be clear, I'm not suggesting fungi are plants, but the trees were sort of being taken care of in the plant realm, but I wanted to focus on other plants. And something else, a sort of third thing that happened at the same time, was that a fern had its genome sequenced for the first time. And I covered this for the publication where I worked. And this was amazing because fern genomes are incredibly large. They're so old, and there's so many copies of, their genomes are huge. And I sort of fell in love with this particular fern that had its genome sequenced. It's this
And when you say,
tiny little fern.
by the way, just so it's funny as I'm listening to you, I'm saying, I hope my listeners go back and listen to what you just said again, because like at one point you rattled off like three or four things plants can do, and it's like each one of them was, as amazing enough to devote a half an hour to. So I
Sure,
hope people are going. But
absolutely.
right now you were talking about ferns, and I hadn't realized, although I must say, when I was reading what you were saying about ferns, I remembered a walk that I took, and I think it's up in Northern California. It's called the Great Trees or something. It's this hike where what I saw besides these great enormous ancient trees was that I was really in a fern forest as well. And I felt like I was in the Garden of Eden or something. And what you are
Mm,
saying also is that ferns are ancient.
they are. They predate flowering plants by quite a lot and have maintained a sort of general body form for all that time. So, certainly millions of years before us, but then yet many, many more years before the first flower even came into being, or the first seed. I mean, as you know, ferns don't have
That's
seeds,
right.
they have spores. which I find it amusing that in medieval times people thought that every plant must have a seed, and because they couldn't find one on ferns, it meant that the seed was simply invisible, and that whoever found it would also gain the power of invisibility, which, that was science back then. So science does change its mind a lot.
That's wonderful. So you go to this for refreshment, for renewal, for wonder, for awe. When did you realize? Well, I did hear, as you said, that not only was it working in that regard, but you realized the reporter side of you said, "Wait a minute, this is a big story." When did you? Was I correct? This is your first book, right?
It is,
So
absolutely.
when did you say this is the book?
Oh, well, I think this was on a conversation with fern scientists. I called one fern scientist to talk about this genome breakthrough,
Mm-hmm.
and happened to be at a fern science. He was at a botany conference, and he said to me, "Do you want me to get another 5 fern scientists on the phone?" And then I had this incredibly delightful conference call with all these fern people
Oh my
who have
God.
devoted their lives to, one sector of plant life, and just the unbridled enthusiasm was totally infectious. And I thought, you know what, I just want to talk to botanists for a while. So it all kind of coalesced into just being the project of a lifetime. I just knew that these were the people I wanted to talk to, plant people, and these were the discoveries I wanted to cover.
Yeah. Um, I, I, I wanted to say something. Let me see. I had a note here, which was just um, that this book has been out 6 weeks, and you have done a good deal of events. When I went online to prepare, I look at, who's written about it, who's reviewed it, what interviews have you done, and there's an awful lot for a first author, first book, fairly obscure subject. Um, there's some combination of publisher, book, moment, writer. Uh, has it surprised you?
It didn't surprise me. I feel incredibly grateful for all of the interest, but I think it speaks to a general sense that everyone was looking for and is looking for, this sense of wonder in the natural world. And people love plants. I mean, we saw how many stories there were in the pandemic of people kind of giving over their lives to their house plants and cultivating gardens. It's when we have the chance to, we're all drawn to plants in a major way. And they are just a continual source of positive, calming feelings. I mean, there is science about this, that time
Yeah.
spent in a forest is psychologically actually good for you. I think everyone's hungry for this, and I just happened to get on the story at the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I hadn't heard of the book. I will just say my own personal experience. I hadn't heard of the book until I got an email from Bick's Book Soup, the bookstore in Los Angeles, where I went and saw you speak and we met. And I get that every month, right? And occasionally I go, oh, I should. This one, I just went, I want to see her. And it was like, so I feel like I'm part of that same hungry public that
That's so
this
good.
idea struck a chord.
Hmm.
Um, so you then said this is going to be a book. Was it easy? I mean, this is a silly question, but was it easy to sell, or did you? How did that work out? Because, as I said, first time author, kind of obscure
Sure.
subject. Even though we realize now, a hot one.
Yeah. Well, the book industry is a funny thing. It's very different from the journalism industry, and I had to sort of learn how to navigate that with
Sure.
the help of a brilliant and genius agent. But the process is you write a proposal, as I'm sure you know, and you sell the book based on the proposal. And the interest from publishers was incredible. There were a lot of publishers who were interested in it, and in the end, I got to pick an editor I thought would be wonderful to work with,
How
purely on creative
great.
grounds.
Oh, good for you. Yeah, no, I was curious about that, but that's good to hear. Um, okay, so that's we've got a bit of the personal story. We'll return to it again late in the hour when we talk about how this has changed your worldview or your what you've taken from this experience. But let's go to the science and the plant story. I've teased the audience, and so have you, with a few of the remarkable discoveries we've made over the last several years. But let me ask you to share, as you do in the book, the stories of two or three of the abilities of the plants who revealed them, how they went about their experiments. It's a big part of the book, what they reveal and maybe the question they raise and all of it. You know, like two or three of those anecdotes, which will really give people a feel for what we're talking about here.
Sure. I mean, do you want to, it's a lot of them exist. So do you want to guide me to one that
Oh
you are
no,
particularly
I
interested
was
in?
going to say your three favorites. I mean, or I guess if I were going to, I could say okay, one that does hearing, one that does communication, one that does dealing with predators, those sorts. I mean, it's there's just
Sure. Absolutely. Well, I love thinking about the ways that plants are able to manipulate animals to do their
yes,
bidding. This is skipping over several layers of the kind of more quote unquote basic senses that I can talk about more. Like you mentioned hearing, we don't associate that often with plants, but they can do their version of it. But in terms of manipulating other creatures, there's so many examples of this. One is yellow monkey flowers. They produce pollen and they're bee pollinated. So bees are scanning for monkey flowers that have lots of pollen. And bees have a sort of screening system where they are sensing for some kind of compound that the flowers emit when there is lots of pollen there for them. And the yellow monkey flowers somehow also recognize the rules of that pre-screening process. And instead of making heaps of pollen, they simply exude the chemical that indicates that they have heaps of pollen. It's very expensive to make lots and lots of that just energetically for a flower. And so the bee is attracted anyway. It's essentially a bait and switch.
yeah.
And the monkey flower doesn't, it's no skin off their back. They still get pollinated if the bee shows up, often with the dusting of someone else's pollen. But it's just tricked the bee into doing its bidding without having to do anything for it. Or another example of
Well,
that is
how about the caterpillar, the death to caterpillar
sure.
trick?
Yeah, yes, that's a fun one because it's something that was discovered in the humble tomato. A lot of our garden variety plants do incredible things. So in the late 90s, a researcher named Consuelo de Moraes, who's a brilliant researcher, and her team discovered that corn and tomato and I believe tobacco and maybe even cotton all do this, where they uh, can sample the mixture of regurgitant and saliva that a caterpillar leaves behind while it's chewing their leaves. And of course, a caterpillar is the predator to plants. They're just carrying off all their useful chloroplasts in their bodies. And so this tomato plant will sample that saliva, identify presumably what species of caterpillar this is, or at least which wasp they need to summon that will come parasitize this caterpillar. So it's sampled that, and then in their bodies, the plant synthesizes the perfect compound that will summon this wasp. And this is a very tightly bound evolutionary relationship with these wasps. And so the wasp comes and it has a sort of syringe-like appendage, and it will pierce the caterpillar and inject its eggs inside to the caterpillar's body. Those eggs will mature and hatch, and the larva will eat the caterpillar from the inside out and then glue its little husks of these like cocoons, these little cottony cocoons, they look like Tic Tacs, onto the outside of the shell, essentially, of the caterpillar. And this is a very slow way that the plant has figured out how to defend itself. And it's interesting because, of course, the other thing going on here is that caterpillars are eating their leaves. They don't want to lose all their leaves. If a plant loses their leaves to caterpillars, they can't photosynthesize and they won't survive. But they don't want to completely starve the caterpillars either, because in many cases with many plants, the caterpillar is just the young stage of the thing that will ultimately pollinate them in the end, which they need. So it's this very finely tuned relationship where everyone somehow comes within this sort of hair's width of death to ultimately survive. So this wasp trick doesn't kill off all the caterpillars. It happens very slowly, but it still does something. It's still attempting to defend itself in that way.
I mean, that one, just the step by step, that it doesn't even stop with, okay, you've got the caterpillar not, eating the full smorgasbord. It's leaving the table hungry.
Mm-hmm.
But then that the wasp injects the egg. You've got three different entities from, if you count insects as being different, it's just it's amazing to. I mean, well, so much of it is amazing, but the intricacy, and as you point out, we marvel at the algorithms in our tech, right? I mean, the algorithms going on in figuring out what what caterpillar it is, how much, how many I need, and how many I want to kill, and I mean, it's just it's it blows my mind. Let me tell
Mm-hmm.
people, we're listening to Freeform, a world that just might work. I'm Terrence McNally. I'm speaking with Zoe Schlanger about her first book, The Light Eaters: How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence offers a new understanding of life on Earth. And you can learn more at zoeschlanger.com. That's ZOESCHLANGER, Zoe Schlanger, one word.com. Okay, so that was one amazing story. How about the one who does camouflage?
Sure, yes. So for this book, I went down to the cold rainforest in southern Chile to see a vine that had been fairly recently discovered to be the first spontaneous mimic that's ever been found in plant life. It's being called the chameleon vine. It is a very normal looking vine. It's called Bocchilla trifoliolata, and it was discovered by a researcher named Ernesto Giannoli to be able to mimic the leaf shape, color, texture, vein pattern, a whole host of other things, to be able to mimic all these features of whatever plant it's growing beside. And I had seen photos of this before I went down, but it just absolutely shocked me to see it in real life, that this is the very same Bocchilla plant can have multiple stems, and those stems can be branching off in different directions and sort of be near multiple species of plants, and still each of its limbs in this way will mimic this variety of plant life that it's nearby.
Wait.
And
Do you mean that? Because I may have glossed over this in reading. Do you mean that the same plant, different stems of it may, because they are closer to different um, other plants, might within the same plant mimic two different plants?
yes, actually, they found them mimicking up to four different plants in
Oh,
the
my
same
head is
individual.
breaking.
I know. It's really amazing. And to give you a sense of how new this is and how few people are studying it in the place it lives, I was able to make a discovery
Oh,
myself, which is that I found the first case of Bocchilla mimicking a fern. It was mimicking a little maidenhair fern growing out of a little outcropping in this forest, and it hadn't been documented mimicking a fern before, so that was very fun. But just goes to show how near to the real moment. I think I went down in 2022 maybe, or 2023. This is breaking news in the plant world, and no one knows yet how it does this, the mechanism by which it mimics these plants. And it's sort of sparked this fascinating debate between a school of botanists who feel this is evidence for plant vision, for the capacity for plants to actually see in some ways. And when I say school of botanists, I mean there's just a handful of botanists that are advocating this position, because they say, hey, this is visual information. We already know plants are covered in photoreceptors. They have more photoreceptors in their bodies and on their leaves than we have in our own eyes. And they're very sensitive to light. And they can do things like figure out whether the plant growing beside them is genetically related, in some cases, simply by the gradient of light that passes through the leaves of the plant
oh my
shading
God.
it. So it's not a totally far-fetched idea that there'd be some quote-unquote vision going on here, but of course there's no brain. There's no place for this information to be sourced or directed to a centralized place and turned into an image, as it is, that's how our vision works.
Right.
So it's a contentious theory. And then on the other side is I think, even more sci-fi idea of how this mimicry is possible, which is that perhaps we didn't realize it, but perhaps microbes, so okay, we're now talking about completely third-party organisms, are actually responsible for things as basic as the shape of a leaf. That it's not the plant itself governing this, but it's their kind of microbiome or their microbial cloud. And that each species might have a slightly different array of these microbes, and that Bocchila is just more porous and receptive to these governing microbes than other plants are, of different plants, and sort of collecting this microbial information and letting it adjust its shape. So it's an open question, but it brings up a lot of questions about what a plant is, and whatever we figure out about Bocchila in the next few years will certainly redefine our understanding of all plant life.
Yeah, yeah, because it mimics the color, the texture, the way it grows, all of those sorts of things, right? So that's why we think, okay, it must be vision, it must be. I mean, how many senses does it take to um, to produce changes in that many cues, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, these are all things we think of as fundamental genetic basics of plants. I mean, I saw one case of the Bocchila mimicking a plant called Raphitemnus spinosus, and Raphitemnus has a kind of curled tip on its leaf. So the leaf meets at a point, and that point curls under and then produces a hard spike. It's like a little claw. And this spike, I mean, when a plant has a spine or a spike like that, it's considered kind of a hallmark of the species. It's a defining aspect of the species.
Mm-hmm.
And yet, Bocchila is able to also reproduce this spike when it's mimicking this plant. And the way Ernesto Gianoli, the researcher who was with me, explained how amazing that was he said that would be like a human growing a rhinoceros tusk. This just doesn't happen.
Right. In other words, the thing that actually is unique enough that it defines another plant, they can duplicate.
Yes.
Oh,
exactly.
my God. One thing you mentioned there that I mean, we will only graze the surface of what's in all this. But you mentioned the microbes. And one of the things that even when I saw you at Book Soup, I mentioned was when we start thinking about how we as humans are related to the rest of nature, one thing that we often don't realize is that this thing that we call our body is actually the home of, I don't know whether it's millions or trillions or billions of microbes, and that they are each doing what they need to do to survive and thrive. And that has a lot to do with who we are and what we do. And is that correct?
Absolutely. I think the current going figure is something like half of the cells that constitute our body are actually contain foreign DNA. They're the cells of organisms that we don't think of as our discrete biological individual selves, but yet in fact do constitute us and constitute and make happen many things we perhaps consider fundamental to our selfhood. Things like, a lot of mental states, moods.
I was just going to say emotions.
Mental health
even
is
yes,
emotions.
The things that we most think are our unique self.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the gut microbiome is something people are really coming to understand,
Yes.
but it goes far beyond that. There's a lot more to it.
Yeah, and again, this is just, we're going to put a toe in this one, but when plants climbed out of the ocean, what they climbed into was a very inhospitable atmosphere of carbon dioxide and toxic elements and so on, right? And it was plants that actually created the possibility of other forms of life existing on this earth.
Right. It's called the Great Oxygenation Event. So they had been doing for a very long time that very thing in the water. Plants started out in the water, and they required all this oxygen, or they produced all this oxygen as ocean creatures, and they climbed out and onto land and oxygenated our atmosphere. So it's very literal to say that we would have never managed to step off the evolutionary treadmill were it not for these plants colonizing land first.
And then the other piece of that is that every molecule of sugar that has ever passed through our bodies was first woven by a plant from light and, what is it?
Light and, the light is the energy that they use for it, so photons from the sun, but it's carbon dioxide and water, H2O.
Right.
And that combination gets ripped apart in made into glucose and oxygen. That's the kind of byproduct of that process. But I think everyone remembers learning about photosynthesis probably in middle school or high school. And certainly I had learned about that and thought I knew everything there was to know. But I had never really sat with the incredible wonder of that fact that we are creatures that run on sugar, mainly glucose, other sugars too. But plants are the only thing that can make glucose out of matter that is not alive itself, that was not originally alive, which means that very literally through photosynthesis, every molecule of glucose that's passed through your body that keeps your brain running, that keeps your muscles running, all of that was at one point made first in a plant body. And then everything else that, every other way you've gotten sugar, let's say by eating meat.
Yep.
Well, that also comes from
Yep.
that animal first eating plants, or maybe several animals down and in the kind of food chain. But the end of it all is always plants, and we're just recycling the sugar plants have made.
Yeah, and I know that we're going afield of the question of their abilities and whether this is intelligence or not, but there's just so many things about the plants and the plant world that I think we either learned and forgot, never learned, or have taken for granted. That I think is just worth putting little stakes in the ground for just how that thing that you maybe liked as something in your garden, but other than that didn't think about it, is really just so crucial to our very existence. So let me have one more story about some of the chemical signaling, which of course leads to a conversation even about language in plants and so on.
Sure. So, like I said, I mean, plants have this incredible extra sense, which is chemical synthesis. They make very complex compounds that each time kind of the gas sensing technology advances, we understand more how subtle and specific they can be to achieve very specific aims. And one of those aims is communication. So when a plant is being eaten or trampled or any of these things, two things are going on. One is that very likely it's priming its immune system to deal with what it is effectively an attack. The other thing is that it is synthesizing chemicals that then get released through their pores. And so these pores are called stomata, and under a microscope they look like little fish lips that open. It's also how the oxygen is released through photosynthesis. But they send these compounds afield out onto the air, and they're then absorbed by the stomata of other plants, and they constitute alarm calls, and it warns other plants of a threat in the area. And so then those plants respond in kind, priming their immune system very often, and will then be better equipped to handle whatever is coming for them, be them beetles or, deer or whatever. But there's all these subtleties to this. There's some research now that found that sagebrush, which California's got lots of, are more likely to heed these warning calls from close family members than they are from stranger sagebrush. So it's all within the same species, but actual genetic kin are more likely to provoke that response of warning, of boost your immune system when they come from family members. There's also research showing that when plants are isolated in a geographic area, they can develop regional dialects of the more universal, quote-unquote plant language of their species or their area, that it promotes slight variations in the chemical mixtures that make up these signals that can be considered regional dialects, which I think is absolutely incredible. And plants are also constantly sensing compounds emanating off of other things, including plants. And I love thinking about this parasitic plant called the dodder vine, not daughter as in female offspring, but Dodder.
Like a doddering old, that sort of thing. Yeah.
Exactly. And so these dodder vines are parasitic, and they don't grow leaves because they don't photosynthesize. They actually are orange, and they get all their nutrients by sucking the nutrients out of other plants. And so it's a major agricultural pest. But this plant is able to choose plants to grow on, to then parasitize, that are better for them. In one experiment, they were grown between hawthorn plants that had been raised with extra nutrient supplements. and on one side, and then nutrient scarce raised ones on the other. So one is definitely the better choice. And these researchers found that before they even made contact with the daughter would choose the one grown with extra nutrient supplements, presumably because it's sampling the compounds emanating off that hawthorn and recognizing where it needs to go.
Wow, wow. Okay, so we've got about 10 minutes left. I think we have to get into the culture of science story and the worldview story, those two stories. So, very quickly, it seems to me that there are some dimensions here to. I'm not even sure what the continuum is, but there's intelligence, there's awareness, there's consciousness, there's agency, there's all these different things going on. Sort of, if you could talk about what what is accepted and what is not quite accepted yet, but maybe around the horizon in terms of,
Sure.
yeah, you get where I'm going.
Yeah, so of course, this whole book is kind of premised on this question of whether plants are intelligent or possibly even conscious. And I want to be clear that we don't have scientific definitions. There's no single definition for intelligence nor consciousness in
For humans,
anything.
for animals, for anything.
Exactly. I mean, or even the mechanical substrates are not understood for consciousness, even in ourselves. So this actually is more of a question for the humanities
Mm-hmm.
than it almost is for research science, even though there's a lot of debate happening about the syntax and semantics and what words to use for plants in the scientific botanical fields. It's really more of a ethics philosophy type question. Um, so right now, what's absolutely understood about plants and widely accepted is that they behave, that they are behaving organisms, which
That's right.
does push the
And
needle.
let me just tell people what she's doing right here to some extent is she makes very clear in the book that different different scientists and researchers are willing to say different things. They might say one thing in the lab and print something else in their peer-reviewed paper and so on. And behavior is acceptable. We've gotten as far as you can say behavior.
Sure, and that's only been acceptable for a short time. Ultimately, even that was raises the hackles or raised the hackles of
Yep.
people in the sciences. I don't know, a decade ago. Um, And then there's the question of whether or not plants are agentive, which is
Right.
actually kind of circumvents some of the issues of the words intelligence and consciousness, which are already laden with so many human ideas of what
Mm-hmm.
intelligence is. Agentive or agency in plants or in anything just suggests that you as a creature have some say over the trajectory of your life, that you have the capacity to make decisions that are profitable for your life based on whatever you're observing in your environment. And plants absolutely do this. And there's some talk now about thinking about biological agency as it pertains to species of plants, that the trajectory of their evolution might be more in their hands than we'd like to think now that it is. And then, once you start talking about intelligence,
Mm-hmm.
which almost is, in a way, a step above consciousness. Consciousness sort of suggests just the pure experience of the world around you. But intelligence is taking that experience and putting it to good use,
Mm-hmm.
and doing so in kind of a flexible, spontaneous way, not rote reflex. You won't always respond the same way. It's not a pre-programmed response, but rather it's plastic and flexible and intelligent. And there are scientists who are willing to talk about plants as intelligent, but it's still a tough one. It's still debated. And ultimately, it will come down to whatever we decide to think about plants, more than it'll come down to some scientific discovery
Right,
that
right.
will
It's not
finally
going to be
confirm that.
what they do. We're right. We're finding out what they do. It's what we're willing, how we're willing to conceptualize and sort of what graph or map we're willing to put on what they do.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah, and I know towards the end of the book you go and speak with someone who's been in this field for years and years, and that's where you say you really realize that to some extent this isn't a scientific question, it's a social cultural question.
Exactly. I'd like to think about the history of something like animal rights, or when we came to understand some animals as conscious, which is still something we're debating now. There was just recently a conference at NYU that sort of bestowed the substrates for consciousness on fish and insects and crustaceans. And that's kind of widening the circle from mammals and birds, which had been declared having the substrates for consciousness in 2012 by
Right.
a
So it
similar group.
took a dozen years to add insects and fish.
Exactly. So the circle is ever changing. We're kind of drawing our own lines in the sand here in a lot of ways, based on our best available science. But uh, one wonders, like, how much farther or how much longer it might take to include creatures that have no brain, no face, a system that is very distinct and unlike our own, but yet has parallels to our own capacity to kind of make good choices. What it'll take to widen the circle to them.
And as you point out, um, it seems to be that a stumbling block seems to be this whole thing. But what about the brain, right? As if
Correct.
that's the crucial piece that puts things on one side or the other. And to my mind, what that puts on one side or the other is those that have brains. That's it's not necessarily anything else, but that I think one of the things that you come to feel more and more, and that is to say, in your years long pursuit of this, but even the reader, is that we have to sort of realize the absolute otherness of plants, that they are so different that our humanistic criteria is a blind spot, because in fact they have faculties, if you will, and abilities that we could only dream about. So to
Absolutely.
think that
Yes.
we're higher in some sort of hierarchy is crazy.
Right. Absolutely. It will take a kind of intense ability to hold the complexity of this in our minds, not reduce plants to like cartoon characters or little humanoid creatures, because they are so alien to us, and they have diverged from our own branch of life so long ago as to be so remarkably different. And yet there are these parallels. And so holding all of that at once and not using words like intelligence and consciousness blithely, but somehow recognizing their otherness when we use them, will be the challenge of our age as it pertains to plants.
As it relates to this question. And part of what we also I referred to in the opening, but I think is that this area, which your book may be a door or window for many people, but this area of plant biology and plant activity, if you will, and plant behavior is a hot field right now. And by hot, I mean conflict, controversy, people afraid of saying the wrong thing, people getting branded as one thing for saying it, interpreting their research. What conclusion do you draw from what you just learned? That this is the sign of, as I termed it at the start, a pre-paradigm shift moment.
So, in terms of this being a pre paradigm shift moment, I think it's a incredible way to study the way that science ultimately changes
Mm.
its mind. We've seen this before. I mentioned with thinking about animal consciousness is one example. It was considered completely normal science to disbelieve the idea that something like a dog could experience pain as recently as 150 years ago. People were doing live anatomy demonstrations on unanesthetized dogs because they thought, anything that a dog does to express its displeasure at such a thing is rote reflex, because humans are the only beings capable of this elevated capacity to experience pain. So science is always changing its mind, and then it becomes completely impossible or ridiculous to think that anything would ever be different once it has gone through that cycle of
Right.
changing its mind.
Yep.
And I'm excited to find out whether or not in 20 years we'll look back on this moment as one of supreme ignorance of the incredible capacities of plants, and our just general inability to have seen that before will seem laughable.
Very good. I know you've got to go. thank you so much. Thank you for falling into this rabbit hole, if you will, and for taking readers and others with you along this path. Thank you, Zoe Schlanger. Keep up your good work.
Thank you. It's wonderful to speak with you.
So again, the book is The Light Eaters, How the Unseen World of Plant Intelligence Offers a New Understanding of Life on Earth. And the website is ZOESCHLANGER.com. Zoe, Z-O-E, Schlanger, S-C-H-L-A-N-G-E-R, all one word, ZOESCHLANGER.com. For this conversation and many other interviews and articles, to join me in pursuit of a world that just might work, go to TerenceMcNally.net or aworldthatjustmightwork.com. aworldthatjustmightwork.com, all one word. TerenceMcNally.net is TerenceMcNally.net. They're the same website. And you'll find there everything I'm up to and archives of interviews that go back 20 years. If you want to receive my weekly email announcement, tell you who's going to be on, what we're going to talk about, and links to probably 10 or 15 articles, good news, bad news, links relevant to the conversation we're going to have, email me at TeMcNally, TeMcNally, TeMcNally at mac.com. You can also sign up at my site to get that weekly email. You can also subscribe and listen to the Freeform podcast on Apple Podcasts and most other major podcast sites. You'll find years of podcasts at my site and at those other sites. Listen anytime, anywhere. Archives include Michael Lewis, Jeremy Scahill, Naomi Klein, Robert Reich, Van Jones, Connie Rice, Doris Kearns Goodwin, Greg Boyle, and so on. You can follow me on Twitter at McNally Terrence, McNallyTerrence. Thanks to Kiana in production, George Vasilopoulos at Progressive Voices, and most of all to you, my listeners. Please share this podcast widely. Thank you, Zoe Schlanger. Keep up your good work.